In a world where women can run for president, transgender individuals hold office, and slavery has been outlawed, many would debate that patriarchy no longer exists, and therefore we shouldn't be concerned about it at all. Jordan Peterson, a Canadian psychologist, actually points to the rates of depression, mental illness, incarceration, and suicide in men as a reason to believe that patriarchy does not exist.
A huge proportion of people who are seriously disaffected are men. Most people in prison are men. Most people who are on the street are men. Most victims of violent crime are men. Most people who commit suicide are men. Most people who die in wars are men. People who do worse in school are men.
But what if this is actually just a symptom of patriarchy? In order to understand how patriarchy still exists today, we need to look at the ideology that made it happen, not just the actual physical evidence. Therefore, we're going to go back to our first video and those 10 steps that Gerda Lerner used in her book, The Creation of Patriarchy, to show us how we built the patriarchy in a systematic way. If I haven't said this already, make sure that you're watching these videos in order because they do build on each other, and I'm using the concepts and the ideas that we talked about in the previous videos to expand into the future videos. As we established in that first video, patriarchy is not just about blaming men, but it's really about a power structure that has controlled all of society for about 6,000 years and structured us, not just in our outward ways, but also in our ideologies through our myths, our history, our stories, our foundational principle truths, in order to shape how we act, think, and behave in our world today. Without further ado, let's jump into those 10 steps that she outlined in her book, Creation of Patriarchy, and see what they said back then and what we are seeing in today's day and age. Number 1, control of women's reproductive and sexual capacity. This originally stated that patriarchy's foundation lies not just in the right to control a woman's reproductive organ, but in its supposed right to exercise control over another soul for whatever purpose it deems necessary. Today, we can see this in the overturning of Roe versus Wade, easiest example, right? But this is about so much more than abortion rights. It's about not just the right to control the womb and the birth canal, but also about the right or the lack of that right to control their body and their full autonomy. This is the state saying it has more right to decide for the individual than the individuals living that experience have for themselves. We see this in the medical decisions that the government feels they have the rights to make for other people, as well as the government interference in gender identity and in marriage and LGBTQ+ rights. Number 2, the male line as the organizing principle of the structure of society. Historically, family and inheritance were defined by the male line. Women were absorbed into their husband's or nearest male relative's identity and lineage. Today, the practice of women overwhelmingly taking their husband's last name after marriage continues to reinforce the structure, symbolizing the absorption of women into male-dominated family units. Number 3, dominance over others and economic inequality. Patriarchy expanded male dominance over women into other forms of subjugation, including slavery and economic exploitation. Today, there is still a disproportionate representation of men in corporate and government leadership, which reflects a modern version of this dominance. Economic inequality persists, particularly for women and marginalized groups. Women face the motherhood penalty, earning less and advancing more slowly due to social expectations around caregiving, which actually also has a cumulative effect, not to mention thousands of unpaid hours of labor. Number 4, sexual subordination institutionalized in laws. While laws may no longer explicitly subordinate women, social norms continue to reinforce these dynamics. The double standards still persist. Men's sexual autonomy and exploits are often celebrated, while women's sexuality and autonomy is often vilified or it is still legislated against. Polyamorous or sexually autonomous women are often ostracized or made to feel shameful, while similar behavior in men is normalized or even glorified, especially as they rise in the class ranks. We can see this when wealthy men gain a mistress or the right to gain a mistress if they wish. Nobody generally bats an eye, or if they do, they don't say anything in public. Number 5, class through sexual ties. Historically, men's class was tied to production, while women's class was often tied to the relationship to men. Today, a woman's socioeconomic status can still shift dramatically based on her marital status. Men rarely face the same dynamic to the same extent. That means that women can often increase their rank of class by marriage, while men hardly ever lower their class based on the rank that the woman has. Again, we see the motherhood penalty play into this. The motherhood penalty and wage disparities underscore how deeply these ideas persist, limiting women's earning potential and tying their worth to unpaid caregiving or their connections to men. Number 6. Subordination of female and female spirituality. In patriarchal system, women's spiritual experiences were dismissed and the feminine divine was erased, shamed, marginalized, or co-opted by the all-powerful male god. Today, our medical complex was and continues to establish men as norm and women as the deviants to that norm. Women were left out of our medical and pharmaceutical studies until the 1990s. Menopause, neurodiversity, and other experiences unique to women are often misunderstood or dismissed, overlooked, underdiagnosed, and therefore often left untreated or unhelped. The dominant image of God as male continues to exclude feminine perspectives from spiritual and religious narratives. While women are now often ordained in some of the Christian lineages, they still use inherently male-dominated language to label, describe, and tell stories about the divine. In the public domain, such as during presidential races, it is a male god who is prayed to. Number 7, the division of women into respectable or not respectable classes. Patriarchy has long divided women into categories: the respectable wife, mother, attached to a man, versus the deviant or sexually autonomous woman, whore, prostitute. And I'm going to add one in here, or the dried up woman who is no longer fertile. Today, this division persists through the cultural stigmas. Think of the cat lady stereotype, which devalues women who prioritize personal fulfillment over traditional roles. Women without children or partners are still judged more harshly than men in the similar positions, perpetuating the idea that a woman's worth is tied to her role in a family. I also wanted to mention something that I've seen out in the zeitgeist a couple times on Facebook and other social media platforms now in regards to this one, is that women who have decided that they want to go at life alone, or they have decided they don't want to be married and raise children together anymore, are being labeled as division creators or as toxic femininity, because men have always included women in the us that got a man to some other exalted position, where women who, when they get to an exalted position, are now saying it is all about them. It's all about the individual, the woman. This is something that I see as just completely gaslighting women and the experience of that they're having, where it's again shaming women into saying, if you aren't for us, if you're not for the being the woman behind the man, then we have no use for you, and we're gonna shame you as you go about your cat lady days. Does that make sense? Let me know in the comments. Number 8, Genesis and the female-centered fertility cults. Genesis reframed creation as male-dominated, shaming feminine spirituality. Today, women exploring goddess-centric or alternative spiritualities are often labeled as heretics, witches, lunatics, or dismissed. Genesis narrative of a male god birthing creation still persists. None of the dominant world religions is of a female spirituality. Number 9, exclusion from divine and political structures. Women's access to God was tied to motherhood. Political and social roles excluded them. Today, women and LGBTQ plus individuals remain underrepresented in government, corporate leadership, and religious institutions. Motherhood is still conflated with womanhood. Menopausal women often complain about becoming invisible in society because they're no longer fertile. Women unable to conceive are disproportionately stigmatized, even if it is her male partner who has the issues, perpetuating the idea that women's worth lies mostly in their reproduction. A close second to this is the unpaid labor of women and minorities that is not tied to the GDP, or i.e. a political structure. And finally, number 10, myths that state women are incomplete or inferior. Women were cast as incomplete men, legitimizing subjugation and a less than status as natural. Make sure that you see last week's video where I go into depth about this, but for now, let's look at a few of these. Today, LGBTQ plus individuals and women are still labeled as less than. Efforts to legislate against their rights, while also legislating rights to reinforce the Genesis myth, all reflect the enduring power of these patriarchal myths. Women continually experience an often invisible story that tells them that they are less than and have to work 1,000 times harder to prove they belong in some sport, field, or workplace. Children's play is genderized by toys for girls being mostly about caregiving and glorifying their looks, while boys' toys are geared to what they might accomplish. So there you have it. We can see clearly that patriarchy still affects us today in these 10 steps that Gerda Lerner outlined back in 1986 that brought us into the system of patriarchy. What about Jordan Peterson's comment that, because men are suffering at higher rates for depression, lack of education, they're graduating from high school and college at a lower rate than women, they are incarcerated more, they are more likely to commit the violent acts of society, and how he uses this as proof that patriarchy doesn't exist. I think that's the universal harm that I keep talking about inside of this cultural DNA that patriarchy perpetuates on us. It harms all of us because men have to suppress their emotions. They're really only allowed to show pride, anger, aggression, violence within that narrowed playbook of patriarchy that they have. They are more likely to be acting out in regards to these emotions because they don't have healthy ways of expressing. Even the elites among us, as I keep saying, also have a narrow playbook that they have to follow in order to maintain their elite status. Of course, they might not see it that way, but when you take the patriarchal lens off, you can clearly see that these people are also being harmed. They probably don't have real connections and real depth of emotion in their lives. They might be suffering from mental illnesses that we have no idea about. There's just so much that patriarchy perpetuates on all of us. I really hope that you've seen how much patriarchy is to blame. Not men, not the elites. Yeah, maybe the elites a little bit, but everybody suffers under patriarchy. And understanding that it's not about blaming men, but that it's about blaming the system, I really do hope that you have a foundation from which to move forward to maybe start re-looking back at the past. In the next couple of videos, we're going to start understanding what deconstruction means and looking at what history really is, as well as what myths are, and how we can understand those through that patriarchal lens that we've now established. Here's a question for you. Looking through this patriarchal lens, what stories, maybe they're not as evident as the ones I've shown you, maybe they're more specific to just your family or your specific culture that you live in, but what stories do you see that are firmly rooted in patriarchy? Which hint, all of our stories are rooted in patriarchy, so this really is not a trick question. But I want you to take a look at that story, just one story that you might have running through your mind, and start seeing it from that patriarchal lens that we've talked about. Go back and look at those 10 steps and see where they might fit in. They might fit in a couple different of those categories. That's fine. Leave your comments below. I look forward to hearing from you. Let's keep this conversation going, and I will see you in the next video. Bye-bye. So much love.